we'll get going. You might notice that we're in a thing that looks an awful lot like a courtroom. This is actually a courtroom where the next two speakers kind of honed their craft. So both you and Kevin spent time here, right? As part of the education for law students, they come down here and beat up on each other in this courtroom. And they actually have, this is a jury box, these are witness boxes, and a panel of judges behind. And so it's part of law school that you come in here and learn your craft. Well, it's also a great place to have schools like this. So, but our next two speakers are going to be talking about a variety of institutional challenges, law, policy, and other things that are part of how do we build out our energy system to the next generation. The transition we're going through is one from where you had one model for energy, which was big base stations like nuclear or coal, and they drove everything, and the load just kind of was what it was. In the coming world, we have to throw in a much greater mix of energy sources and a much greater mix of demand-side management, and so it becomes exceedingly complicated and something for which current system is profoundly incapable of responding. So Adam Reed, who is a member of RACI, is going to talk to you about some of the economic and institutional challenges, and then you're going to hear from Kevin about some of the policy issues, and then Steve Lawrence after lunch is going to talk about business challenges and economic challenges. So Adam, you want to start us out?
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. We're going to be working over the next couple hours on making you really, really depressed about the world, particularly because we're going to be focusing on the United States, which is a particularly depressing area of the world when talking about renewable energy deployment. But the advantage of this is that if you can think about renewable energy problems at the institutional scale in the United States, you can think about them almost anywhere, because we have the most fragmented mess of a system as you are likely to encounter anywhere. And so they'll be focusing on U.S. issues here and the U.S. grid. We'll be looking and thinking about these issues in a kind of global sense. Feel free to stop and ask questions as we go. We're going to move through the slides pretty slowly so that we have a time to kind of talk about various issues and also get some stuff on the whiteboard, major issues that we talk about. All right. What are we covering here in this talk? This talk is going to cover the U.S. electricity grid and its governance institutions. So we're going to talk about ISOs, RTOs, PUCs, PMAs, FERC, what we call TLA soup. TLA stands for three-letter acronym. Many, many three-letter acronyms. We're going to talk about the techno-economic challenges of PV integration into the power system and the role of grid governance in meeting those things. So we normally think of policy as it relates to renewable energy as something that has to do with RPSs, PTCs, more three-letter acronyms, right, related to tax codes and cap and trade and all that. But there's a whole other layer of problems that are also policy questions and technical questions. They are socio-technical policy issues, and they work at the grid integration level. And even if you could get everyone to agree on how much solar and wind and hydro we need to integrate into the grid, actually integrating it is a challenge all in itself. So we're going to talk about some of those things that exist. I like to call it the Morlock level. It's that area where the Morlocks work, right? If any of you are familiar with H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, right? The Morlocks are the cannibalistic creatures underground that control all the machines that make life good for the dumb people on the top, right? We are all the dumb people on the top, and the people that run the grid are the Morlocks. Thankfully, they're probably not going to eat us, but they know a lot about this stuff, and I've spent the last couple of years trying to help understand what they know and what they don't know, because that's an equally interesting question, what they don't know, because most of them don't talk to each other. So a guy that knows how to run one portion of the grid doesn't know how the next portion of the grid works. If they have to trade energy, in the West in particular, they call it the telephone. They talk to each other. They say, hey, I need this much. Okay, they send that amount of energy down. It's archaic, and it's something we have to come to terms with if we're going to think about large-scale renewable energy integration. We'll also look at some examples, both new and old, of grid governance and its effects on grid economics. Later, we're going to get to some other issues. So we won't cover these issues here. Rather, Kevin and Steve Lawrence are going to cover these. We're not going to cover the purely technical issues of PV grid integration, so the things that you folks are all going to work on and know about largely are not what I'm going to focus on here. We're not going to talk about quote-unquote law and policy as it is commonly understood. That means renewable portfolio standards, production tax credits, feed-in tariffs, CO2 taxes, cap and trade. That's something Kevin's going to cover in the next talk. We're also not going to talk about the business challenges. We're not going to talk about how PV installers face particular financial issues or how owners and operators of renewable energy are integrated in a market sense into the grid. That's something Steve Lawrence will cover afterwards. All right. What is grid governance? Why should we care? This word, it's a term that I kind of coined to state all of those policy issues that we don't do at the legislative level, but that occur at the grid level. And we can look at this system as a series of competing concerns. So we think of the electrical grid as a big machine. It's in fact the biggest machine in the world. But it's more than that. It's a giant socio-technical system. It has operations and reliability issues. It has cost and equity issues. We have to make sure electricity is affordable for everybody. It has to be available to everybody. We have environmental concerns. It has to be green. We have transmission concerns. We have to be able to expand the transmission system such that we're capable of getting our renewable energy from where it is to where it's needed. We have system security issues on top of that as we put more and more devices and communications on top of this grid to help us integrate more of these renewable resources. We become more vulnerable to cyber attacks and other sorts of problems. And so we have to think about those as well. At present, creating a secure, reliable, affordable, green electricity grid requires understanding how these concerns concurrently drive decision making. So we have a number of different governance concerns, and the point here is not that we can't co-optimize these concerns. We certainly can. The problem is that in the US and elsewhere, the jurisdictional governance of the grid is fragmented, meaning that the same people who make decisions about transmission planning are not the people who make decisions about system reliability, are not the people who make decisions about environmental concerns, and are not the people who make decisions about cost, equity, and fairness. Those are all vastly different organizations. They're vastly different agencies. Some of them are governments, some of them are not, some of them are individuals. And so getting all of these things to work together to co-optimize this system is very challenging. We're going to talk about how that works. Okay, we're going to spend some time on this one. So, because this is a course about solar energy, we're going to think about these grid issues within the realm of solar energy integration. So we're going to talk about, okay, we need to integrate solar energy into the grid. Beyond the purely technical issues, what sorts of institutional issues tend to crop up when we try to do that? And what I've presented here are 3 different time scales that talk about different concerns related to that. Yes, sir?
Just a quick question before you get into this. When you say grid, you mean everything from production to consumption, like just transportation?
Correct. Yeah, so when I say grid, I'm using it as a shorthand for the entire electricity system. So generation, transmission, distribution, consumption, everything. Thank you for clarification. So we're looking at 3 different time scales, and these could be broken up in any number of different ways. You could break it up into 12 different time scales if you wanted to, but this is kind of a helpful means of thinking about these issues. We have a seconds to minutes time scale, we have a minutes to hours time scale, and we have a month to year time scale. And on each one of those time scales, there are a number of policy issues that we have to think about at the grid level. And these temporal slices are orthogonal to the governance slices, right? So different governance institutions will have different roles in each of these temporal issues. So when you think about any kind of grid integration issue with regard to wind or solar or any, especially intermittent renewables, you want to think about, okay, what time scales am I dealing with, and what kinds of governance institutions, be they state regulators, federal regulators, grid operators themselves, cities, who's involved in making these kinds of decisions. So the first layer we look at is the seconds to minutes realm. We have a couple of different areas we have to worry about here. We have to worry about balancing energy between balancing authorities, so that even within a single balancing authority, a grid operator, as it were, that orders dispatch and takes care that the grid doesn't crash at any moment. We have to ensure that there is enough energy on the grid to meet demand at exactly that amount, or the whole thing goes down. We have to make sure that there are operating reserves available, meaning that if suddenly there is a weather event that takes out our solar or that adds too much wind, we're able to cycle our conventional generation in such a way that we don't cause a major balance problem or cause a frequency deviation or other kinds of issues like that. And we also have to have generators online to provide voltage regulation. All of this occurs in seconds, sometimes microseconds, right? Very, very small amounts of time. A lot of it is automated, but in many areas of the country, it's not automated. And you'll find as we get into kind of a geographic analysis here that the West has a very different system of dealing with this than the East of the US does. And the differences are vast. On the minutes to hours scale, we have to worry about how do we commit units within minutes or about an hour or even several hours, right? So we're worried about how am I going to know how much renewable energy I'm going to be producing on my system in 15 minutes, in 30 minutes, in 45 minutes, in an hour? How do I know which of those units I'm going to be able to commit and rely on, and what level of confidence I have in the ability of that generator to provide what it says it's going to provide at the time it's going to provide it? And if I'm dealing with energy storage, I have to wonder, okay, how much should I be storing if I need to match up when those units don't necessarily provide what we need out of them, right? And at the same time, this is all one system, right? So I also have to worry about what my conventional generation is doing. So I have to worry about when I'm going to be able to ramp my conventional generation, and depending on what kind of conventional generation mix I have, be it coal, nuclear, gas, those are very different questions, right? Because you can ramp gas way easier than you can ramp coal. We'll talk about that in a little bit. On the month-to-year time scale, we have to worry about very different concerns. And the kinds of people that deal with the month-to-year time scale are an entirely different class of people and professionals than deal with these other two time scales, right? So the people that plan transmission, that forecast demand 5 years into the future or so, that look at big shifts in where we're generating our electricity, oftentimes don't have real big communication linkages between the people who are managing the grid from moment to moment, or minute to minute, or hour to hour. And so understanding how there are cross-cutting issues that do in fact involve both of these types of people, even though they don't really know how to talk to each other, is one of the challenges we have to face. Let's see. All right. Let's start at the first level. So if we go back to our previous chart, we're going to look at this first box here, system operation and reliability. So this is just one layer of governance that relates to the grid. It has to do with how do we keep the system operating and not crashing, right? And this is essentially the NERC portion of the talk. NERC stands for the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Now this is interesting, right? A corporation that regulates other corporations. This is just an example of how complicated all of this gets and how murky the authority gets. NERC is a quasi-public, quasi-private institution. It is authorized by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, not to be confused with NERC, to impose standards on every electricity operator, every end user, every service provider in the United States and Canada. And each one of these regions is what we call a NERC control region. And primarily, our grid operator, the person who's actually sitting in the control room and determining when to dispatch what resources onto the system, lives in terror of NERC regulations because the fines are very hefty. So, if you're a system operator and frequency dips above or below 60 hertz, which is the frequency for our system here, other countries use different frequencies, or if I get too low voltage or anything that causes a threat to the reliability of the system, big fines come out. So as a system operator, I have a very close relationship with NERC, and I'm very afraid of NERC. NERC was developed after the 1967 New York blackout, which lasted about 3 weeks. And the industry decided that this can't happen again. And so they worked with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to develop NERC and submitted themselves to NERC authority. Other interesting things about this is that we start to see some overlap and some non-overlap jurisdictional boundaries already. So if we look over in the West, we have this giant block called the WEC. That's the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. This is one giant integrated AC circuit. It's all connected. It's one big machine. TRE down here, the Texas Reliability Association, is another big integrated AC circuit. It's its own machine. And then everything here that is not WEC or TRE, also often called ERCOT, this is all one circuit, even though it has multiple regional organizations that carry out NERC's control performance and disturbance control standards. So, a couple of interesting things come out of this. One is that the WEC is only tied to the eastern portion of the country by DC interties. Right? So we have these interties that allow you to sell energy from the WEC into the eastern portion of the country, but you have to take out the frequency component first. You have to turn it into DC in order to get it across that line. Also, notice that there is only one region here that is entirely within a single state, and that is Texas. And Texas loves this, because this exempts Texas from federal jurisdiction. Texas gets to run their own system. FERC doesn't get to tell them what to do. Because they don't cross state lines, FERC has no jurisdiction. That's a constitutional limitation. All these other regions, because they're big systems that cross state lines, have federal jurisdiction. So FERC has a say in how the system is operated. Interestingly, Texas has done a lot of interesting things due to the fact that they're relatively small compared to these other grids, and they get to have one integrated governance institution. And we'll talk about that in a bit, but it's rather surprising. You wouldn't think Texas would be a leader in innovative governance thinking, but they are, at least when it comes to the grid. All right, so what we have here is a very ugly map of the same NERC reliability regions overlaid with what we call balancing authorities. Yes, sir?
So you said NERC is run by FERC, so does that mean Canada and the small parts of Mexico are submitting to U.S. control of electricity?
Great question. So NERC is not actually run by FERC, but it's empowered by FERC and its Canadian equivalent to charge operators for any deviations in frequency. So it is an example of international cooperation between the grid operators. And yeah, NERC is a multinational organization.
Sorry, was there something between CERC and, can you go back a slide?
Yeah.
What's that sort of model region between CERC and SPP? Is that another region?
Yes, that is another region. And the reason this looks the way it is largely because of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So there's a big mix of kind of federal and state jurisdiction here. This is in the process of being turned into a large RTO, a regional transmission organization, which we'll talk about in just a second. But all of this, and actually if we go to the next slide, this is a perfect segue. We see a whole lot of independent balancing authority areas right here. All of this is within the next 3 years going to become a single balancing authority. It will all become the SPP RTO, Regional Transmission Organization. And that's a big deal because it's really good for renewables to have RTOs. Notice here, each one of these balancing authorities, which we also call system operators, essentially runs their own little portion of the grid, right? So they are, in many cases, they are the old 1900s electric utilities that initially developed the system, and they operate on a least cost basis, right? So they own the generation, they own the transmission, they own the distribution, and many times they have a captive customer base that has to buy electricity from them. They can't buy it from anybody else. And so whenever they need excess or whenever they need to sell excess electricity or buy electricity on the system, they can trade with another balancing authority. And this allows for some bilateral trading, but it's pretty hard to coordinate this many balancing authorities, particularly if you're trying to get renewable resources from one portion of the country to another, which is kind of a unique new challenge we've got. So all of this is being consolidated into something that's going to look like this. That, you can't read it, that's PJM. So PJM, which is Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland is what that stands for, essentially took what used to look like this in the eastern seaboard and turned it all into a single balancing authority, which allowed for a single dispatch area. It also allowed for much more complicated market operations, real-time markets, 15-minute markets, hourly markets, day-ahead markets. You don't have any of that, say, in the WEC, for example, where really all these balancing authorities are on their own, and occasionally they trade. If they do have some trading in energy, it's bilateral and long-term, multi-month, sometimes multi-year contracts that don't have a real-time market or an ability to respond in real time. They have to rely on their own system assets to meet those things. All right. Before we get to who balancing authorities might be, we're going to look at a really cool chart. So this chart, let that get going. This chart is developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It is a modeling of the U.S. electricity system by the Regional Energy Deployment System, the REDS model. And notice that it's in 2050, right? So this is not our grid right now, but it's what modelers think the grid might look like in 2050 with our current set of policies in place. And you can see here a couple of interesting things. One, if you look at each of the balancing authorities, you can see most of them are located in major metropolitan areas. And the blue is load, so that's all of the energy that's being consumed within that balancing authority. So customers that are in that balancing authority are demanding that electricity at this particular time. We can see this here. We're moving from January through the year 2050. We can also, if you go to this web address, you can also make it go real fast. The purple we see as generation, right? And notice you can see this thing breathe, right? You can see the diurnal cycle. You can see how you've got day and night fluctuations in load and in generation. You can also see how energy is being funneled to various parts of the country, right? Like an enormous amount of energy generated in the eastern seaboard has to be transmitted to Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Right? These balancing authorities require a lot of energy, and as we'll find out in a second, the southern area of the country, the southeastern portion, is about as disorganized as the WEC, although it tends to have a little bit more utility control than the WEC does. But still, you can see a lot of energy kind of moving along these lines. And then if we take, this is winter, right? If we go to summer, we get a very different picture. Let's get that line again. Now notice we have a lot of energy trading going on here, right? These bright yellow lines indicate transmission of electricity between the balancing authority areas. But in the West, much less, right? Most of what we see is right here between the Pacific Northwest and California. This essentially is transmission of hydropower from big federally owned dams that are operated by the Bonneville Power Authority, which is a federal government agency, to be sold into California. So California is buying electricity there, and actually it goes the opposite direction at other points of the year. But that's the major trading that happens in all of the West is between California and Seattle. And that's about it. Everything else kind of is on its own. This is a big issue if we're trying to integrate large amounts of solar and wind energy, because this is where all the resources are. All of our sun is here. But how do we get it over here if none of these guys talk to each other? Okay, let's go back with the lights, please. Thank you. That'll take a second. All right, last thing we want to cover on this are, who are these people? What are these white dots? The answer is complicated because we don't have a nationalized grid in the US. So we have a lot of different entities that control the grid. How about some guesses? Who might these people be, these Morlocks? Regional energy suppliers. Okay, so I'm going to say, we're going to call those power marketing agencies. So power marketing agency is a big regional entity. The two of them that we have in the country, actually we've got three of them, but the major one is WAPA, which is down in the southwest, and BPA. WAPA is the Western Area Power Authority, and then BPA is the Bonneville Power Authority. These are federal government agencies, and they sell electricity into the grid from federally owned hydropower dams. They are not the owners of the dams. The dams are actually owned by different agencies, usually either the Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation. But there's a specific federal government entity that does nothing but sell the energy from these dams into the grid. They also own a lot of transmission assets in the area. So a lot of times the transmission assets are owned by these federal power market agencies. Who else? What other types of entities might be these white dots? Utilities. We got two different types of utilities that are the big players here. The first are IOUs. Let me see if I've got a better pen over here. Second are MOUs. So an IOU is an investor-owned utility. So that's a utility that exists for profit. It tends to be pretty large. And they were the big behemoths of the early 20th century. So the investor-owned utilities, who, if you are here in Colorado, our power right now is being provided by Xcel Energy, which is an investor-owned utility. They have a state division called the Public Service Company of Colorado, or PSCO. And they essentially are a private company that is regulated by the government to control its prices. There's another type of utility called the municipally owned utility. And this would be something that's owned by a city. So if you go up to Fort Collins, for example, you will not be getting your electricity from Xcel Energy. It will come from the Fort Collins Municipal Utility. Those are not for-profit electric utilities. And in the 1920s, there was a huge fight over which of these would end up building out the electric power system. And the IOUs won. And it's not because the IOUs had any particular advantage over the MOUs. I mean, if you think about large municipalities like, say, Washington, D.C., New York City, that sort of thing, the municipally owned utilities certainly had the wherewithal and ability to build out a large grid. It was because the IOUs invested a lot of money in convincing the public that they were the right people to do the job. And it was money that the ratepayers paid for. So ratepayers paid money to the utilities for their electricity that later got funneled back into convincing school children that investor-owned utilities were the only people that could manage the grid. There's a fascinating book about this that I don't think is currently in print, but the next time you're in an old library, go look for it. It's called Power Ethics by the Federal Trade Commission, a guy named Jack Levin who worked for the FTC. And it is a 200-page exposition of exactly how this all worked. Everything from grade school to college-level education related to the value of the investor-owned utilities. And it reads like something out of today's headlines. I mean, you can really see how the social issues have come full circle. We're dealing with all the same ones all over again. Who else? We got PMAs, we got utilities. This one's out of ink now. What else we got? Good thought. So states or regional governments? This is a good question. In Europe, very much the case. Grids are often state-owned in Europe, but they are almost never state-owned in the US. And it's because of a historical accident. It was that in the mid-1800s, states began investing in major infrastructure. Waterways, railroads, and they lost their shirts in it. States got a lot of money and investment from private investors to go create these waterways and railroads. The waterways came first. Everyone thought in the kind of early 1800s that the future of transportation was building canals and pushing barges down the country. And then railroads came along, and suddenly no one needed canals anymore, pretty much for anything. And so all these things went belly up, And most state constitutions were amended at that time to prevent state ownership of electric utilities or utilities of any kind. And then when electric utilities came around, it just so happened those things were still on the books. So, great question, and no state or regional government ownership for the most part. You'll see occasional outliers, but for the most part, no. There's one more major category that we haven't talked about yet, and it relates to the New Deal. Any guesses? These are rural electric cooperatives. One of the big things in the New Deal was extending electricity to everybody. It was a great way to spend large amounts of government money, which is what the New Deal was all about, right? Spurring the economy by spending lots of money on infrastructure. So, what better thing to do than to make everybody's home electrified? And that's what we did with rural electric cooperatives. There are many, many, many rural electric cooperatives in the country, hundreds. Yeah, hundreds on the high end, close to thousands. And each one of them has authority over a particular part of the country. We call them REAs. If you look at a map of Colorado, you'll see probably 40 of them all over the place. They're little companies. They are owned by the local governments, or not really owned by the local governments, but they are tied to a particular locality, and they essentially buy and sell power on the wholesale market. A few of them own their own generating assets, but for the most part, they are just marketers. All they do is buy power at wholesale and then resell it to their customers, and they try to do that using essentially long-term price-fixed contracts. Right? So they're trying to find the lowest price possible for their own members who actually own the rural electric cooperative. And each one of these REAs together own a G&T co-op. So in Colorado, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Kansas, we have something called the Tri-State Generation and Transmission Company. It's funny because it covers 4 states and it's called Tri-State, but it's still called Tri-State. And Tri-State is our G&T co-op for this region. And it is owned by its member REAs. Now, you would not think this was the case because it always seems like Tri-State is the one pulling the strings and not the little REAs. But technically, the ownership structure runs the other direction. What happens is that the REAs all own the generation and transmission assets together in the G&T cooperative. And then they have price-fixed contracts with the G&T cooperative to use a certain amount of generation and a certain amount of transmission every year. And so if you try to get a renewable energy association, for example, and these are often the places where renewable resources are located. Right? So I spent some time in the San Juan Mountains a couple of years ago in the little town called Rico that has 250 people and is right below Telluride. They have one of the biggest geothermal developments, or one of the biggest geothermal resources in the state of Colorado. And they wanted to figure out how they could make a geothermal power plant and sell that into the market. As it turned out, they couldn't, because they were part of the San Miguel Renewable Energy Association, and they had long-term contracts with Tri-State that required them to buy all this power from Tri-State for years and years and years. So they could build a power plant, but there was no one to buy the power because they were tied to these long-term contracts. If they weren't tied to the long-term contracts, Tri-State would go bankrupt, right? Because they couldn't sell all their energy. So it creates an interesting kind of institutional question that quite possibly our least organized and least regulated type of balancing authority happens to have all of the renewable energy resources. Quite an interesting problem, right? Okay, moving onward, we're going to talk about economic dispatch. So this has to do with not just system operation and reliability, but we start getting into some economic questions here. So resources are dispatched in order of least cost. That's the way power system operators work things. The lowest marginal cost resource, the resource that has the lowest additional cost for producing an additional kilowatt hour or megawatt hour or whatever of energy, is dispatched first, And the higher cost resources are stacked into the mix until we have enough energy to meet demand. And if we go back to our doohickey here, let me see if I can find it. Kevin, do you remember where this was? The dispatch stack?
I sure
The one on the right. I'll try to find it afterwards. So these charts below, which are produced by NREL, show a modeling study of the West Connect region, which is a transmission planning region within the WEC. The WEC has a number of different transmission planning bodies. This is one area. And it looked at the question of, well, what would happen to this grid if we integrated a whole bunch of wind, like 30%, a lot of wind onto the system. And what we see on the left, before we integrate any wind, is that really all of the variation in daily demand is covered by natural gas. That's the your combined cycle turbines here, and hydro at the top. Now, why wouldn't you use hydro for baseload? Why would you want to cycle your hydro? You wouldn't seem to need to do that. Any ideas?
You can pump up water, for example, to store the energy in there.
Yes, we could store the energy through pump storage. That's done somewhat, but it's not really what drives this phenomenon. Right? If you were designing a power system from the ground up and you had a bunch of hydro, you'd probably try to meet your base load with it. But that's not what happens in the US.
Hydro's a lot easier to turn on and off than coal.
Yeah, hydro is way easier to cycle than coal, and it's owned. Who owns all the hydro in the US? The feds, the government owns all of it, right? So the government owns all this hydro and they sell it at wholesale. And as a utility operator, I don't want to buy stuff at wholesale unless I have to, because that costs me more money generally, right? So that's why we cycle hydro. You won't necessarily see this in every country you look at. Sometimes hydro would be used as baseload. But because of its easy cyclability and the desire of utilities not to go onto the wholesale market, it tends to be used that way here. Now, when we integrate a whole bunch of wind onto this was the worst day in the study, keep in mind, right? So it's not like this every time you integrate wind. This was just as bad as it gets, according to the study. We see a ton of cycling of the coal and nuclear, the coal in particular at the bottom. That's a bad thing, as you all know, because coal doesn't cycle well. It loses a lot of efficiency. You still end up with a lot of emissions from it. It makes your system relatively inefficient.
Which color is which power?
Sorry? The blue one here, right, where's that laser pointer? There it is. That's your coal right there, and then the wind is here. So the wind essentially displaces the natural gas, and then the coal has to cycle to meet the variation. You're still using some hydro, and you're using more peaking gas turbine. The red here are gas peakers, as opposed to natural gas combined cycle plants. So a very different looking mix. So power system operation like this can also be influenced by the type of market that's operated. And we're going to look next at how our power markets differ between different areas of the country. Because this sort of thing, if you end up having to cycle a lot of coal, obviously that's a bad thing. If you could keep your coal steady and then trade this wind into other balancing areas and use more natural gas if you've got it, then you can probably get a better system. But you need some interconnection to do that, and how well you can do that depends on what your system looks like. So, to talk about markets, we have to go back in time. Yes, ma'am?
Can I go back a slide and ask a question about
Yes.
the cycled hydro? So you said the hydro was managed and owned by these federal agencies, but is being demanded in a fluctuating pattern by the, I guess, the grid operators. So how do they know when to turn it on and off? Do they, have to be communicating in real time about that?
Yeah, they communicate in real time about that, or for the most part, you'll have a schedule. I mean, you know that your demand is going to cycle like this. This is just the course of a day, right? So it goes low at night, it goes high at the top. And then to the extent that you have to vary from day to day, in the West, where most of this happens, the grid operator will literally call up another grid operator on the phone and say, we need this much in 15 minutes, can you do it? And it's really archaic, but that's the way it works. If you talk to any grid operator or someone who works on this system long enough, they will eventually say the following words to you: it's a wonder the thing works at all. It's really amazing that it works at all. I mean, it's so disorganized, and yet the lights stay on. They haven't flickered once. I mean, it's just astounding. All right, so before we talk about markets, we have to talk about some philosophy. So the philosophy here has to do with an eternal battle that has been raging since Roman law, and I'm pretty sure the Romans stole it from Judaic law, between the justus, if I can find a marker, there it is.
I'll go get some minerals.
This one will work. Thanks, Mike. The justus Pretium, this is Latin, and the natura Pretium. The top means just price, the fair price, and the second means natural price, the market price. And these two things are as old as time in terms of price regulation and economic regulation. And in the 1670s, that guy on the right, that's Lord Chief Justice Hale of ye olde England, came up with a treatise on law called De Portibus Maribus, or De Portibus Maris, of the carriage of the sea, essentially. Certain occupations are, quote, affected with the public interest. Right? So, not all things, but certain things, if you undertake to engage in the selling of certain things like electricity, obviously not in 1670, but in 1670 there were other things like this: inns, bakers, brewers. If you brewed beer, you were affected with the public interest. That's how important beer is, folks. Never forget that. You had a duty to charge just prices. You couldn't just charge what the market would bear. You had to charge a price that allowed everyone to consume the good, and you had to do so at fair and reasonable rates that didn't make an excessive profit. So we can see in 1670 why all of these things would be important, right? Obviously, you needed beer. Why?
Water was too dirty.
The water was too dirty. If you drank the water, you'd probably die, so you had to drink the beer, right? So beer was public water in 1670. You needed inns because, well, you had to travel a lot more. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have phones, that sort of thing. Notice that many of these things would not be considered goods common to the public or affected with the public interest today. We have other ones now, right? We have water, we have electricity, we have railroads. All of these things are what they call public utilities, right? Not public goods. They're often confused with public goods. Public goods are things that you don't pay for at all. Things like national defense, right? You just pay for them through taxes. But a public utility is something that is controlled by the government, but may be operated by a private entity, or it may be operated by the government, but you pay a rate to use it, and that rate is controlled. By putting yourself in the position to provide these things, these critical goods that everybody needs in order to play a meaningful role in modern society, you submit yourself to regulation. The gentleman on the left is Chief Justice Morrison Waite of the U.S. Supreme Court, who wrote an opinion in 1877 called Munn v. Illinois, which is the most important Supreme Court case in utility regulation ever, because it essentially said that this is the chase. We're going to adopt this public interest standard to the regulation of public utilities. That case had to do with railroads and the ability of the state of Illinois to regulate the price of railroads. So little's changed today, except everything's changed. Right? In some portions of the country, the grid is still operated according to these principles. There is a rate, it is controlled, there's a single company that provides it. In other parts of the country, that's changed completely. We have competition now. We've gone from a Justus Pretium type system to a Natura Pretium system. And what's more complicated, they often intermingle with one another. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how those things intermingle. This slide is a traditional monopolistic utility regulation slide. So essentially, this is the just price one. Thanks, Mike.
I won't listen for a while.
So this is how traditional utilities are regulated in places like Colorado and in most places in the West, with the exception of California. And what you have here is a division of the world into non-overlapping sectors. So utility A serves a particular service territory called Service Utility Territory A. And utility B serves a different service territory. And if I live in Service Territory A, I cannot buy power from utility B. I can only buy it from utility A. And because utility A has me captive, its rates are regulated by a Public Utilities Commission, which is a state entity that controls the price of electricity. Now, thanks to, before 1976, essentially only the far left side of this graph existed, right? Every utility had its own generating assets, its own transmission, its own distribution, and it served its own customers, and it was regulated at the state level. In 1976, Congress passed a law called the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, or PURPA, which allowed for the creation of non-utility generators. These are IPPs, independent power producers, and also the power marketing agencies were essentially empowered to sell as well, although they had some ability to sell prior to this. But essentially, this was the birth of the renewable energy industry. It happened in California for the most part. They built a lot of wind out of this law. And what it allowed them to do was it said, okay, you as a non-utility can set up your own generator and you can sell energy, but not to customers. If you sold it to customers, you'd hurt the utility's business. And the utility needs its customers because it only makes about 6%. It makes exactly enough money as it needs to attract capital for new assets. It doesn't make big profits, or at least it's not supposed to make big profits. So we're not going to let you sell to the customers, but we'll let you sell to the utility. And the utility has to pay you at its avoided cost. Whatever it didn't have to pay to generate that electricity, it buys from you. And so this created a wholesale market for renewable energy for the first time. And we can see this wholesale market up here. It goes from the generator into the transmission system. It also allows utilities to trade between one another. And all of these transactions are regulated at the federal level by FERC. Now, FERC has a very different role than the PUC. The PUC is a Justice Pretium regulator. It regulates prices for the good of the public, and it does that by controlling the rate of a single monopolistic producer. FERC does the opposite. It's a Natura Pretium regulator. It doesn't mean it doesn't regulate. It does lots of regulation, but its role is not to keep rates low. Its role is to make sure the market is fair. It's to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in the market, and through competition, to keep rates low. It's two very different philosophies about how you keep rates reasonable. And they exist in the same system, right? At the retail level, we have this just price regulation, and at the wholesale level, we have a wholly different kind of regulation. And when we get into areas that don't have this type of regulation, we'll still see some vestiges of just price regulation. Any questions about traditional utility regulation? Yes, sir.
Just a quick question about those green arrows going back up. What's the, I mean, in terms of customers giving it back to the distribution, how does...
Oh, it's a dollar sign there. That's just, that's the rate, right? So we see here, I'm doing this in transactional schematics, right? So the blue is the flow of energy, and then the green is the flow of money. Other questions? Keep in mind that this is highly abstract, right? So it's very unlikely you would ever find a single jurisdiction in the country that actually works exactly this way. This is just to illustrate the concept of traditional utility regulation, which still exists in many places, about half the country. What we have here is a very different system. So this is a restructured electricity market. And what's happened here is that the utility has been broken up, theoretically, into a lot of different types of entities. So you've got separate owner of your generation, a separate owner of transmission, a separate owner of distribution, and sometimes an electricity retailer who actually markets the electricity to the customer. So what is this Rube Goldbergian contraption? Why would you do this? It looks so much more complicated. What are you trying to do by doing this? Yeah, you're trying to break up the monopoly. You're trying to create a Natura Pretium system where competition keeps prices low rather than a direct government regulator. You still have a regulator, but their role changes. They're not interested in controlling the price anymore. They're interested in ensuring that the transactions are fair. Now, the person who operates this whole thing is a power exchange or balancing authority, most often an independent system operator, an ISO, or an RTO, a regional transmission operator, which in many cases is the same thing. Often regional transmission operators own the transmission lines in an area, so they will actually divest a utility of its transmission lines and operate them as an independent third party. It might also be operated by a single utility, as is often the case. The utilities didn't go away when many regions of the country went to competitive markets. They were still regulated in the traditional sense, but the market got broadened. Only one place in the country created a fully open and competitive system by completely destroying the old utilities. Texas, the only place in the country that has a fully open and competitive electricity market, where there are no legacy utilities anymore. Everything's operated by the ISO RTO, there are independent generators, and the utilities were essentially broken up, even if they were big, into smaller companies so as to create competition and destroy market power. Really interesting stuff. But for the vast majority of the country that uses restructuring, this is not the case. The big utilities are still the big players. They just have a much more complicated system in which to operate. We have 3 markets that occur within this system. Actually, we have more, but there's 3 on the wholesale side anyway. The generation owners sell energy in the form of electricity to our retailer, which might be the same person as the generation owner, right? This could all be owned by a single utility that just operates it as though it has market transactions. Or it could be all broken up like this. It sells energy to the electricity retailer. The electricity retailer then resells that energy to the customer, and this is not regulated by the PUC if it goes through an independent retailer. Because, well, if the customer doesn't like the rate that they're getting, theoretically they can go find another provider with a lower rate. Who here has been to Texas? Have you driven through Texas and seen billboards for energy companies? You don't see it here, right? You don't drive by and have Excel saying, we keep rates low. They don't have to, right? Paul, did you have a share? If you drive through Texas, there's like 50 different electricity companies, and they're all competing for your business. It's terribly confusing. They have things like, it's like a smart grid nerd's dream. You know, they talk about time of use rates on billboards. It's fantastic. Another market, right? So we've got our direct energy market. We have a wholesale market and then a retail market, neither of which is price regulated. We also have a transmission capacity market, right? Because now, as an owner of generation, I may not own my generation or my transmission lines anymore. So now I have to find a way to get my energy to the customer. And we can see this blue line here. The flow of electricity is not along the flow of the transactions. So think of this as being a retailer, right? This is eBay. This is how you find your customer if you're a generation owner. This is FedEx. This is how you get it there. 2 completely different transactions. We also have emerging ancillary service markets between generation and transmission owners. And notice these go both ways. Sometimes the owner of transmission may be providing ancillary services back to the generation owner and vice versa. This has to do with the ability to keep this system operating as we incorporate more renewable energy onto it, which is happening thanks to renewable portfolio standards. Questions about this very abstract schematic of restructured electricity markets? Yes, ma'am?
Will these people get in trouble when the electricity market is much
It's the ISO RTO. So the balancing authority that's operating the market is responsible if there's a problem on the system. Yes, sir?
So, to use your analogy, when I order something from FedEx, they put something in the mail and it comes to me. With electricity, it's all the same juice flowing through the wires. So, if I have company A instead of company B providing electricity, what's going on there?
Nothing in a physical sense, right? This is all a fiction, right? It's all a fiction, an elaborate Rube Goldberg machine made to create the illusion of competition. Right? That's it. There's nothing physically different happening. It's still the same old system. It's just got all of these contractual arrangements done for the sake of trying to move from one system of regulation to another. Really good question. Yes, sir?
Is this a giant waste of money to do this, or is this actually beneficial?
That is the question, right? I don't know. What do you all think?
It seems overly complicated to me, like, all this advertising you're spending, like in Texas, for example, although that's different from the Texas version. This is an analogy of Texas, or this is different?
This is the way Texas actually works.
Okay. So all that extra money you're spending on advertising and all that is coming back to the consumer in the end.
Yeah.
So it seems to me like you're overcomplicating it and causing more cost for the consumer.
So it's more complicated. Yes.
Well, but I guess I, as a consumer, actually have a choice now who I want to pay for generating my electricity. I mean, I'm not exactly sure where the German market fits in there, but I know that I have, in Germany, I can choose to buy from a supplier who has a nuclear power plant, or I can choose to buy from a supplier who doesn't have a nuclear power plant, only runs renewable energies. And it just depends where my money goes in the end. So I do have an actual choice compared to, yeah, I can only buy from one company and they make the rate that I can't do anything about.
Yeah, so this is the main debate right here. It's inefficient to do things this way, but it opens up all sorts of customer choice and ability of independent generators to come onto the system. So the big question is, which one of these is better for renewables as a market structure? I don't know the answer. I don't have a good answer to it. Anyone have any ideas?
So it sounds like in the former model, renewables would only come on if they were regulated in and ushered in by the regulation authority, and here they would come on kind of the same way people buy organic produce.
Yeah, you could theoretically create a separate, and they do this in Texas. This is largely what's helped Texas have such enormous growth in wind over the last 10 years, is that they can create a retail market for renewable energy that allows consumers to express a preference for higher cost but cleaner energy.
Don't you think this kind of a structure makes the tariffs more complicated for the consumer, for example, that goes older, is not expert in this stuff I mean, how they deal with this stuff about from the consumer side, because, for example, a person who is not expert as an electrical engineer, who is not really expert in this structure, how they understand these tariffs.
It is a lot like a cell phone, right? We all have cell phones. We all hate our providers. Everyone in Texas hates their electricity provider, but they hate them slightly less than the other people that they're not using, theoretically speaking, right? I know exactly what you mean, though. Boulder introduced a smart grid experiment a couple of years ago. They invested a whole bunch of money in putting in smart meters, and they moved to an optional time of use rate structure. Now, I work on electricity rates for a living, and I couldn't understand the placard I got in the mail that explained how the rates worked. I didn't even participate in the study. I was flabbergasted by it. It seemed really confusing. So that's a really good point. This makes things more difficult for consumers. It's going to get even more difficult when we start going to time of use and real-time pricing rates with the rise of smart grid technologies. Is this going to work? Are consumers going to adapt?
Well, again, from German experience, there was recently a study that over 2/3 of Germans have never changed their energy supplier because it's just too complicated, and they just stay with the one they have because they just don't want to figure it out.
Yeah. In California, this happened as well, right? That most people in California, when California went to an open market, did go to a new provider. They stuck with the old PG&E or Southern California Edison or whatever their major utility was. And in 2001 to 2002, a little company out of Houston that was doing some really funny stuff called Enron caused rolling blackouts by manipulating the wholesale electricity market in California, which stopped California's electricity restructuring movement in its tracks. And now, if you didn't switch initially in California, you can't, right? So California has the kind of paradigmatic example of a hybrid system here, in that if you're a customer of PG&E in California, Pacific Gas and Electric, you're stuck with them, you can't move. But if you moved out when they were restructuring in 2000, 2001, you can keep changing systems. So they have these two parallel systems in place because no one can get anywhere on the politics of this. Other questions, comments? Yes, ma'am?
So are there any examples of a hybrid solution between these two where you could have like entire cities choosing between, like there would be a a competitive market of retailers, but then the entire city would make the choice of which retailer to be the supplier for all the consumers in that city. You know what I mean?
At present, no. Boulder is one of the few places, and Paul can talk about this better than I can. Go ahead, Paul.
I was going to comment. In Texas, for example, the city of Austin chose not to participate in the whole mess. It's not quite what you're saying, but there are municipal utilities like Austin, for which all this doesn't apply. They said we don't be part of the whole mess.
Yeah. And the advantage of being a municipal utility is most municipal utilities were formed in the 1940s or the 1930s or even the 20s before the IOUs had an ironclad grip on control of the system. Boulder recently tried to become its own municipally owned utility and is in the process of exploring that process right now. And it was a huge debate here, huge public debate over municipalization of ownership in Boulder. And so the question there was, you know, what sense does it make at this point for individual cities to go back to being municipally owned utilities, particularly if they have a political demographic that is amenable to renewables in a way that the general public is not. And that continues to be a really fascinating decision. There's a ton of misinformation on both sides about how that actually happens. No one really knows because no one's made a municipally owned utility in decades, right? So there were people at the Boulder City Council talking about how we were going to cut the power lines at the border of the city and run our own system, which is crazy and illegal, right? You can't do that. It's against federal law, right? If you own a transmission system, you have to provide access to it to anyone that wants to send electricity across of it. That was part of PURPA. And then on the utility side, right, their major argument was, well, the city's incompetent, they would never be able to run their own electricity system. No one actually knows what this is going to look like, which just makes it really fascinating. Yes, sir?
So with the second type of market, Natura Pretium, there isn't a market out there that, I mean, you've got the just price and you've got the natural price based on markets, but what market makes you internalize all the costs that are associated with the production of your goods so that it's truly an efficient and real market?
You know, I don't think that is a question that doesn't necessarily suggest one or the other, right? Because you can create a market system that still relies on competition, but that includes the cost of an externality, such as a carbon tax, right? You can work a carbon tax with this real easily. You just tag on the cost of the carbon to your generator. You can do the same thing with a regulated utility, right? We do it with RPSs. We say, okay, Xcel Energy, you're providing power in Colorado, you have to meet this renewable energy target in a way that is going to presumably internalize your cost.
But most markets that are of the latter type of natural markets purposely are set up to not internalize your costs, right?
It's a good point, yeah. It's probably harder. Although, you know, people that are carbon tax folks would always say that the carbon tax is the easiest way to go. Of course, it's politically untenable in the United States. But, you know, it is the simplest way to design the system. And it doesn't matter which of these you've got. It works both ways. It's far harder, for example, to design a cap-and-trade system that takes account of both of these types of systems. You've got to design two separate compliance mechanisms for it. Maybe more, probably more. Kevin, I know I am way past my time here. I don't have a whole lot more. Continue. Yeah.
I just had a quick question. So as a customer, let's say, if I wanted to put solar panels on my roof, right, and then just use those solar panels and not sort of, you know, use regular electricity, can you sort of isolate yourself from the rest of the system?
Yes, you can.
Oh, okay.
It's hard to do, but it is legally feasible to go completely off-grid as long as you aren't selling your excess electricity to your neighbor. You can't do that. That's illegal because the utility has the lock on your system. But if you were to go completely off-grid, you could do that without the utility's permission. The problem, of course, is that if you want to build enough solar panels to meet all of your need, you've got to meet your peak load, right? So you need a system that's probably 20 times oversized for the other 23 hours of the day when you're not using the peak load. So it ends up being really expensive. So what folks want to do is they want to build a system that allows them to use a lot of their renewable energy but still rely on the utility system to get the extra energy at peak. In order to make that work, you need what's called a net metering law that requires the utility to essentially pay you the same cost. Otherwise, the utility will end up charging you way more for that little bit of electricity you need to discourage you from putting on the solar panel. So in Colorado and in many other states in the country, we have net metering laws that say, okay, you put your solar panels on and then essentially whenever that solar panel is generating, it runs your meter backwards so that you're getting the same cost of generation there as the utility is incurring in terms of rates.
So you're sort of selling it back to the grid.
Yeah. Now, Xcel Energy, after a couple of years of dealing with the net metering, pushed through an amendment to this law in the state that limited the size of your system to 120% of your previous year's demand. Right? So you couldn't be too independent. And you certainly couldn't make a business out of selling energy back to the grid that would have been viable for you. Right? You could only use as much as you could to reduce their amount. Now, there's two ways to look at this, right? One is to say, my God, look at those greedy SOBs. You know, it's terrible. On the other hand, Xcel Energy is a regulated utility, right? They don't make a whole lot of money. At least, well, PSCo doesn't make a whole lot of money. We'll get to this in a second. But if they start losing demand because people are putting up solar systems, they end up with a huge generation system full of coal and natural gas and whatever else they're using that they can't pay for anymore because they're not selling enough electricity to do it. And that puts them in a really difficult position. So it's hard to separate these two things, the equity of the company and the desired freedom of the consumer. A way to get around this is your Rube Goldberg market system. Yes, ma'am.
So Dennis is right. I hear you called I cannot put solar panels on my roof and sell them to someone?
No. No, you cannot.
But why?
It's for the same reason. It's because if everybody started doing that,
then they would have to shut down their coal plants.
then well, they'd go bankrupt, and all their investors would too, right? Yeah.
So what happens if the transition between traditional power systems goes through the smart grid? Then what happens with the smart grid? Because in the smart grid is like bi-directional. You produce, you sell, and maybe you consume in each. It's like totally different system. What happens to smart grid?
So smart grid, it comes into this in a couple of different places. One, it makes this a more bilateral type thing, right? It also allows, not just in renewable energy, but also in demand response, right? It creates much more effective markets for demand response, particularly at the industrial and commercial level, right? As a consumer, you can put every smart grid gadget in your house, you'll probably save $100 a year. Hardly worth the time or effort. But as a building operator, like a building of this size, if you could integrate with the grid that way, you could probably make a decent amount of savings on your energy.
And more energy storage in the system does affect anything in this structure?
Yeah, it's likely that we'll see more energy storage in the system if we get to a level to where we have a carbon limitation that doesn't let us use natural gas. Right now, natural gas is so cheap that nobody's investing in storage because you can do the same functions with natural gas and there's no carbon limitation and it's way cheaper. So storage is kind of it's a back burner market at the moment unless we get some kind of carbon legislation passed. Yes, sir.
So I know it's a complicated market. So I wonder, is there any market like the investing company in the stock market? So allow the customer not buying the stock directly from someone. I can buy something from the investing company. That investing company will do everything to save as much as possible for me.
They do this at the commercial level using energy service contracts. So if a commercial facility, you can essentially have someone come in, look at your facility, see how much energy you're using and say, okay, I think we can save you this much. And they will actually take the first cost of all of the installation of energy efficient materials, smart meters, etc., set up the system, and then they will make money off of the savings of the system over time.
Yeah, but there's something about the facilities. But is there anything like they choose to buy from different generators and keep the rate as low as possible, just like the investing company choose to buy rare stocks? Like then they do this combination, like to maximize the profit.
It's interesting. I think that's probably a question that Steve is going to be far better prepared to talk about than I am, okay. As that really gets into the business side of things, which I am not as well versed on. But let's keep that discussion going. All right. Let me see what else we've got here. I'm not going to go through everything, but a couple extra important slides here. We can see here a map of all the organized wholesale markets in North America. So all the shaded regions here are ISO regions. So these are regions that have somewhat restructured markets in one way or another. Notice, about half the country, and it happens to be the part with a lot of the renewable energy, does not have functioning organized markets, which makes it really hard to get renewable energy onto your system because it's hard to plan transmission in a market like this, right? So if we go to the next slide, let's skip ahead a little bit. These are the transmission planning agencies in the United States. What's the first thing that jumps out at you about this map?
It's different than the other one.
It bears no relation to the rest of the map, right? You go back to the system, the people who are actually running the grid, and it's a whole different set of organizations. There isn't an organization that runs the grid in the WEC, but we have 1, 2, 3 different organizations that plan transmission in the area. Questions on transmission planning? So, what's some of the things that make transmission planning for renewable energy difficult?
But you have to talk to a ton of people who produce in that area and who sell in that area and different regulations in every part of your planning area.
Yeah, and even if you had a regulatory scheme that was unified, there are going to be winners and losers with every transmission line, right? There are going to be states that don't really get anything out of it, right? If I want to produce a whole bunch of wind power in Wyoming and sell it to Los Angeles, I have to go through Utah and Nevada to get there. Utah is not really going to benefit all that much, right? But they have to put up with having a transmission line built. And because there's no WEC RTO, there's no regional transmission organization to plan that system. Note, SPP, MISO, New York ISO, NEISO, PJM, all of these guys are the same institutions as we see in the other grids here. Right? So here you have a unified system operator transmission planning body. But here, the transmission planner has no way of controlling the system operation.
So how closely tied into government are these organizations? Like, did Congress pass a bill and say, okay, this is stupid, you're all done, we're doing a national one?
Yes, we could do that. The problem, of course, is that Congress is run by people who are representatives of these states. Right? And the WEC, for reasons that are not entirely clear, is allergic to RTOs. The WEC does not want an RTO. They're currently looking at putting in what's called an energy imbalance market to try to take advantage of this integrated system to allow them to balance the rising quantities of renewable energy that are coming onto the grid. But they are very, very worried, and it might actually kill this market before it emerges, that this thing could turn into an RTO. And no one can tell me why that's such a bad thing, but they're very adamant that they don't want it to happen. So when I figure it out, I'll let you know, if ever. Texas has a really interesting system. Notice it's not on here because it's ERCOT, right? It's a single organization. It does all the operation, all the planning. ERCOT does this thing called CREZs, Clean Renewable Energy Zones. So whenever you're building a transmission line, I think I'm going to end, we'll finish here because we finally got the transmission. Whenever you're building a transmission line, you need to make sure that the transmission line is utilized as fully as possible in order for it to pay for itself, right? If you build a transmission line and you don't use most of its capacity, you can't charge the tariffs that pay for it over time. So you need your transmission line to be as close to 100% utilized as possible. The problem with that, with integrating renewable energy, is that wind has a capacity factor of about 30%, right? 40 if you've got a really advanced turbine. So if you're just building a transmission line out to a wind farm, you're not using almost 2/3 of your transmission line capacity. So what Texas did was they say, okay, we're going to take our Natura Pretium system, which is competition in all of its glory, completely unsullied by these federal bastards, and we're going to create our own solution to planning transmission. So what they did was they found a region of the country, a region of Texas, that had about 5,000 megawatts of developable renewable energy capacity. So 5,000 megawatts of wind could be developed in this area. And we're going to put an imaginary node in the middle of that, and then we're going to build a transmission line that's 1,000 megawatts, 1/5 of developable capacity. This ensures that you've got enough supply to keep that pipe full of wind power, right, as long as you mix it with natural gas to deal with the temporal problem. But what they did was essentially say there are going to be losers in this market. We're going to let lots of people come online. We're going to let them use this transmission line, but 4/5 of them are going to go out of business. They're not going to be able to provide it, but we make sure the transmission line is paid for. How would you do it within the opposite kind of system? How would you make sure your transmission line's fully utilized if you did it within a vertically integrated utility? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
You regulate and force different providers to put electricity through at different times of the day.
You could do that, or you could just have your utility co-locate your renewables with a dispatchable resource. In the current market, that's gas. In, God, I hope, 20 years, storage, right? Something like that. But at present, be co-locating renewables and gas in the same place, right? So instead of taking your gas where it's located, you move your gas close to your renewables, and then you generate gas and renewables in the same place, then you fill up your transmission line, it gets paid for. Questions on transmission? Any others? All right, I'm going to hand over the baton to Kevin here. Should we take a break, Mike?
If we need a 5-minute bio break or so, do we need that? Everybody seems to be okay. You can go take a bio break on your own. So let's get Kevin up here.